This recording is for the Dixon Public Library Oral History Project. Today, July 22nd, 1998, I'm talking with Ardeth Riedel. We're at her home here in Dixon, and we're going to talk about Dixon. But first, I think we should get some of the interesting family history. Well, what do you know? I think you know a thing or two about your family history, don't you?
Well, I tried to dig back a little bit and find out where we came from and how we got here. I've got two sides. I've got my mother's side and my father's side, but the father's side is the one who landed here somewhere around Monterey, and I don't remember the date. He was 17. That was the John Seaver Sr. And worked his way up here into this area, got married about 1885, if I'm not mistaken, and settled in the Dixon area on the west side of the town as a farmer. And Kettenberg was an old German name. A lot of German families that settled around here, so probably why he headed in this direction. So he had 8 or 9 children, but only 4 survived. And my Aunt Annie was the oldest of the bunch in '85. My father was born in '87. He was the John Jr. And Uncle Otto was next, somewhere down the line, '83, something like that. And Uncle Henry. So the 4 of them made it up into their 90s. And you see that a lot in the old families around here. What it is, whether it was the water or their lifestyle or what. Lived for a long, long time. I was not born until after my grandfather died, which was almost too bad. But by the same token, getting back to the old families, I'll stick more with the Seavers family, you know.
Your father's.
My father's side, not that I didn't like my mother's side, but she really didn't get into town, into Dixon, until 1932. She lived in Winters from 1922 till 32, and that's how my father met her, because she was married to Leon Smith, and they had a little boy, Gilbert, lived over on an orchard. But she wasn't the happiest of campers over there because she was a city girl living in the orchard. And so finally, somehow through the school dances or whatever, they would have dances on Saturday nights then in the old schoolhouses, and she met my dad. And then she had a very good friend who lived very close to my dad's farm. And when her husband would go off to do odd jobs, because the orchard business wasn't so good then in the 20s, we're getting into the Depression time, see, she'd go over to visit this good friend of hers. This good friend was also married, and her husband would go off with Leon to do these odd jobs. Good friend had B. Sweeney as a special friend across the street. My mother met my father. So B. Sweeney and John Seavers would go to visit my mother and her friend who lived in this house near my dad's place. And then they would just have a very wonderful time together. But they were just supposedly old friends. And then when my mother got a divorce from this Leon Smith, and in 1932 she married my father. And they moved in to the Dixon area, still out in the country. We were out on Sylviaville Road. And my father at that time was like 43, 40. He was 44 anywhere when I was born. So, or 45 something. So that made him relatively older. And so when his dad died, I was not there yet. See, and all of my cousins were much older than I, except for a couple who came a little bit later. So, because my father had to wait so long to get married, going back to his 2 brothers, they were drafted into World War I, along with 2 stepbrothers, and so he was left to do the ranch and all of that. He had to wait till the boys got back from the war. Mm-hmm. This is my recollection of World War I, because it's being handed down to me. And so those 2 boys got married and started their own little places. So it took John a long time to kind of get on his own, you know. And when he married my mom, he had bought a place on at Sylvieville, or on Sylvieville Road, not too far from his old homestead, which was what people would know now as maybe the old Harrelson Dairy, but it had belonged to John Severs Sr. His first wife, Anna, died of something like bad water because it was too close to the pig farm, or the pig, or the little where they keep the corral.
Mhm.
Bad water, something, and about three children all died, which was not very good. But in those days, no doctor. I mean, well, the doctor was in town, but they didn't hardly know what to do for this anyway. I've got a couple of death certificates, and they said died of pneumonia or something. They didn't.
Now the three children, did they die because of the water?
Well, my dad would tell me these great stories about Ernest, and there was another Henry before this Henry who lived, and one died because he choked falling out of the high chair. They used to tie him with a tea towel, okay? Well, he slipped, and he choked. Then another one, he said, died because he ate green plums. But a couple of them died along with the mama, along with a cousin who had come over from Germany to work on the farm with John Sr. And that was all around 19... Oh, mercy. It was 20-something, I don't know.
Now the real problem was lack of a doctor then.
Yeah, lack of getting the word, and by the time they got to the doctor, which is like 6 miles into town, and get the doctor back. I mean, we didn't have phones at that time yet, So the town itself had doctors. We had Dr. Hall. We had, I can't think of his name without all my notes, but we had a couple of doctors in town. We had a dentist, and it was just that people didn't get into town from the country. See, I'm from the old farm things, just like some of these others that you will interview, and you did most of it on your own. My dad would tell the story about when he was about 8, I guess, and he somehow got this humongous big old piece of wood stuck into his toenail, really deep. Either bumped it or kicked it or did something, and his dad, who was a very tight German, offered him 10 cents if he would hold still while he cut this big old sliver out. He said, and I did it, because 10 cents to them, in those days, was just something else. So my memories of those days are whatever my dad would relate, and they were some good stories. I don't know whether you want me to get into the harvesters and the whatsoevers. My mother's side was Irish and English, and they were a joy to know. Her dad was a poet type. He sold insurance but didn't really like it, so he loved to read poetry or recite it to you, and I loved it. By the way, I am an only kid, other than my brother, my stepbrother, and he was like 11 years older than I. So my recollection of him I'll tell you later, but I'm trying to recall my feelings for the ones that were alive, like my grandparents, and there were none on the Seaver side, except my dad and his brothers and my Aunt Annie. They were the oldest ones left on that side. And then the Tupper side, which is my mother's side, there was quite a gang of people that lived down south, and they would come up to visit. And they loved the fact that we were on a farm. And this will be up into the 40s. Let's see, what else are you going to ask me? Anything else there?
Oh, whatever you want to talk about.
Am I still on the family?
Sure, yeah. You've got a pretty interesting family.
Well, they were. I mean, just as any others might be. As we get into, of course, I don't remember the 20s too much, and my mom and dad weren't married yet. We get into the 30s, and I hear the stories that come from that. And my mother had written a diary in 39. She only wrote 4. Her dad wrote one every year from the time he came back from World War I, 1922, I think, something like that, every year up until he passed away in 55. Ah, fun to read through those. I mean, not a lot of newsy stuff, but every once in a while there'd be a good tidbit.
Now you have these diaries?
A whole suitcase full.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, it's absolutely wonderful. Anyway, my mother, Muriel, wrote one in 39. And kept track, which was great for me because, see, I was only going on 5 then. So I read through this every once in a while to recall what I must have done as a kid. Kids don't remember everything they did. One of the things we did as kids in the 30s, late 30s.
No, you were born in
34.
34.
May of.
So what's the earliest thing you remember?
Well, that part I don't remember. I remember my
But you're
father
impressed
could
by
not
it.
go. I was born in Sutter Hospital, and my Aunt Annie had to take my mother because they were harvesting. This is May 20th. So my dad couldn't go. I mean, harvesting came first. So I was being born over there, and I presume they stayed 3 or 4 days like they always do, and then back to the ranch. And hot. The wives had to feed the harvesters, depending on what field they were harvesting. If they were in my Uncle Henry's field, Aunt Mary did the feeding of all these harvester guys. And then if they were in my dad's field, then my mother would feed them all. See, for the length of time that they were there harvesting the grain, they did the feeding.
So
That was
did you
chore.
have a pretty big crowd of guys?
Well, I would say the table was pretty well filled. There must have been 6 to 8 of them, you know. Now, some of the families, you get into the Schroeder families or some of those, they would have bigger fields, and they might have anywhere from 18 to 20 people coming in to eat, you know, because they had hired hands. We did not. We were not the wealthier group. We did not have hired hands, except for maybe 1 or 2, but we would have nephews would come and help from the Van Zant side. They'd come out and help with the hauling of the grain and whatever else might be needed on the harvester. Okay.
So your family were dry farmers then?
Oh yes.
Barley, I suppose?
Barley, wheat, yeah, not too much in the oats thing. Sometime now, as my dad said, they were the cereal grains, is what he referred to them as, you know. And then, so that all went up until the end of the 50s when they brought in Lake Berryessa and the Monticello Dam, and all of that area changed. The grain farmers, at least from what I recall, and I'm just going by my recollection now, would all have sheep. Not necessarily thoroughbreds. There were thoroughbred sheepmen here like Howard Vaughn and stuff, but we'd get them from the auction or something. And they'd have anywhere from 50 to 80, 100 head of sheep. And this is what they used after they had cut the grain. They'd put in a herd of sheep to browse around, and then this would be a little extra money that would come in from the wool or from the lamb or whatever. Basically, they sold it for the wool.
So what was left out in the field after the harvest went to feed the sheep?
Went to feed the sheep fertilized the field.
Oh, that's
Pretty good deal,
efficient.
huh?
Yeah.
Not bad. The problem was getting the sheep from hither to yon. And when you lived on Silverville Road and you had to get your sheep from there over to Halley Road and Severs Road, that was like about a 3-mile, 4-mile drive by foot with this herd of sheep. And since we did have border collies, but they didn't know how to herd, and I was the only child, and, you know, after my brother went off to San Jose. So I was basically the dog, the herding dog. So if a sheep got through the fence and out a hole, I got to chase it. That was my chosen thing in life for that period of time. I was also the one that went to get the cow to be milked because it would always go clear to the farthest corner of a 100-acre field and bring it back to the barn, which was at the other corner.
You said the cow. Was there only one?
Oh, sometimes we'd milk a couple, but usually my dad would just keep one because we couldn't handle more than that. These were Guernseys. They had cream that would get a foot deep. Now you're getting me off on cows. I was telling the sheep story. Now, wait a minute.
Okay.
So we drive these sheep all the way over to another field that my dad said his father called it the batch camp. They built this little house on it, and this is where the boys lived until they got married. But we fell heir to it when my grandfather died, or my dad did. So we drive the sheep over there and turn them loose. It was really, really hot, sometimes we would lose one or two. This is my first experience of death with the animals. You know, when you're a kid and you watch something like that happen, it's a little bit upsetting. And so they'd get overheated because in the time that we would be driving would be probably around June. You know, it's all been harvested and off go the sheep. Then again, you have to bring them back. So at some point in a couple of months, we would drive them back. So that's the herding of sheep. The cow story is that on a farm, most of the people would have at least one cow because that's where you got your milk and your butter, you know, whatever. From the sheep, we would get your lamb. Once in a while, they would buy a pig or two, but no more than you thought you could use, see. And you would raise that. Sometimes my dad and Uncle Henry would go together, or Otto, whichever, and they'd buy one or two, and then together, when it had been fed and fattened up, then they would slaughter this pig themselves. Mm-hmm. You know, our kids have just missed out on so much. Milking the cow, I never really had to milk the cow. I kept the cow fed, like with the figs that were picked up off the ground under the fig tree. My dad insisted we pick all these sweet things up. Going to church on a Sunday, we would stop and pick up sugar beets that had fallen off of a truck. And then my dad would take it home and chop it all up and give it to the cow to make the milk sweeter. So anything, Morning Glory, he said Morning Glory was very good, so I get to take the cow out on the roadside, you know, and we'd either tie her up or I would just herd her up and down the roadside because Morning Glory grew there, and he said that was very sweet too. He had these things all figured out. What would be the best thing for this cow? Well, it was excellent milk, you know. When you milk the cow, it came in on a pan, a big round pan. My dad had a skimmer, and when the cream would rise, he would skim this off into a bowl. And then he'd skim it a second time. Then this milk would go just into a quart jar or whatever and into the refrigerator. By this time, we did have a refrigerator, not an ice box. My grandma in San Jose had an ice box, which I thought was fascinating. But we had a real refrigerator. And then my mother would make the butter from this bowl of cream. Sometimes they keep some cream aside, like to cook with or whatever, bake or something. Best butter in the world. Cream.
Oh, let me turn this off. Okay, we had a little telephone interruption there, but now we're back in business. Let's see, we were talking about milk and cream and cows and things, weren't we?
Well, just, I guess my recollection of the farm, and...
You know, I've talked to other people, and I would ask them about the Depression. How did it hit Dixon? And every one of them says the same thing. They said, well, we were self-sufficient.
Exactly, I was just going to say...
We had the cows, we had all that.
I don't remember how in the world they must have gotten other things. I presume they would come in and like maybe, my mother did not bake, so I mean a lot of the farm wives did their own breads and things, you know, like that, I'm sure. So I presume we came into town to buy bread. But at the pig thing, they would get these pigs and raise them up and slaughter them. The smokehouse, I mean, my kids wouldn't even know what a smokehouse was if it hit them in the face. It's a great thing. It looked like a little old outhouse, and so carefully tended, and the best sausage and hams and bacons would come out of that. Of course, it's a wonder we weren't all killed, but I guess my dad knew how hot it was supposed to be, how long it was supposed to stay in there. My recollection is just merely the taste of that great meat and the smell of that smoke from the smokehouse. Oh, something else. And lamb, you'd think I would hate lamb after chasing those buggers all over, but I love it. I mean, this is great. Back to the sheep. When they would shear the sheep, there would be a sheep shearer who would come around, and you'd get a hold of him somehow, and he would come to your place, and that you get all the sheep into the corral, and then one by one, I guess my dad would get somebody to come help him. They'd bring the sheep in and shear these sheep. They'd wad it all up into these big balls of wool. Then you have a loft in the barn, and they'd throw it up on the loft. Big hole cut in the loft, and this big old wool sack would come down, would hang, maybe about, 8 feet long. And they had a ring that they would tack it around and then drop it through this hole. That would hold.
One sack, 8 feet long?
Oh, yeah. So they'd throw these balls of wool down in there until it was about, a third full. Then they'd drop me down in there to pack it.
Mm-hmm.
My dad had gotten me some cowboy boots, because I loved nothing better than to dress up like a cowboy. And he said, now that'll make your boots shine. So I'd hop in there. Hot? Oh my gosh, and they were always shearing like around July or some horrible time. And then I'd work my way up to the top, and then he'd drag me out. And I'd look at these boots, and they were like kind of grimy. You know, if you've ever taken any just kind of an oil and put it on boots, it does not shine until you do a little licking a promise to them. Well, he got me for a few times that way, and I don't know who else he put down in there, but that was a tough job, stomping that wool down. So that's another sheep story. But the other things like gathering the eggs and raising turkeys. This is that old German make everything pay type of thing. And we'd buy chickens. Go over to Winters. Some men in Winters had chickens, and we'd get the little babies, or if he didn't have enough that were coming just from our own eggs and stuff to set, then he'd buy some and have pullets, and then sell them, I guess, to other people, because we didn't have a freezer, and there was no way of curing those things. The turkeys, he would raise the turkeys to sell for the holidays, and he might kill anywhere from 20 to 25 turkeys on a Thanksgiving or a Christmas. And he'd always give one to the pastor. When he married my mom, my mother's folks lived in SanOse. Can I let the dog out?
Okay. Dog out.
Okay. One of the things I recall, and part of this is coming from my grandfather's diaries, was that when my father was courting my mother and when we would go down there on a visit, because we were from the farm, my dad would kill some chickens and get them all dressed and ready to go, or a lamb and take a leg of lamb. My parents or grandparents would just come unglued because they lived in a city. And it was very tough to get in, especially Depression time. And even during World War II, times were hard, food was hard to get, and they had the little ration stamps. So if my father would come with any butter, eggs, any of that kind of stuff, my grandma loved to bake. So all of this was greatly appreciated. And so that's why all the farmers say, hey, we had no problem. It would be a special deal. And all of them would have gardens, for their own kinds of vegetables that they liked, or ear corn, or that kind of stuff. So you were a fortunate person, really, too. Maybe you didn't dress as well as the in-town folk and whatnot, but I wouldn't change that life for anything. I'm just sorry our young people don't have that experience. I'm very happy to have the Mayfair, because that still keeps some of that alive, of the history of what happened on the farm. And little kids can learn, at least they know that a sheep is woolly and a pig is prickly.
Mm-hmm. Well, what about the Mayfair? Tell me about that. That's a pretty old tradition, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. I've got the history of that too.
Well, what's your history concerning the Mayfair that you remember as a little kid?
Oh, well, that's not what I mean. I mean, I did the history of it. I searched it. That's my hobby, you see, is searching back the history. But I was on the fair board, but since that happened in the 70s, I can't talk about that. But because I wanted to know more about, correctly. They wanted to advertise it as the oldest fair, something. But Dixon always celebrated the Mayfair, but it was really May Day. It was on the 1st. May Day is the 1st of May. So they would all gather at picnic time. In the earliest days, they did not really have a picnic ground. They had some place over west of town, west of the railroad tracks, where they gathered for a while. And the earliest time where the Mayfair is held now, that they actually gathered there, was in 1886. And a group of men had gotten together called the Dixon Driving Park Association, because they loved to race their trotters. And they were breeding these good lines of horses. And they, were trying to race up and down the Rio Dixon Road or someplace like that, but they really wanted to gather as a group. So they formed this association, pooled their money, and went out to this area and purchased from Peter Nicholas Peters this 10 acres and put in a track. And then eventually they built a little grandstand. And I've got some old photos showing the people watching these trotters. Oh, that was something. The people would all come, bring their picnic baskets, you know, and find some trees that had been planted. Then later on, the park area was used for ballpark also, because we didn't have a real official ballpark. The May days that I remember, we were still calling it the May Fair, or May Day, I should say. Had by this time become a 3-day thing, I think, because we got out early.
Why the change in name? May Day, May Fair.
Oh, well, because May Day was only one day.
Oh.
And so then what happened was, as they became known, they were the Solano County Fair later on for a long time. And they decided they would, about the time that Dixon Chamber was formed, 1909, they thought that having the May Day parade had started. The parade was, I guess they started their parade in '86 also, because then everybody would gather downtown and take the route out to the fairgrounds. That was a procession. And they would have a May Queen. See, they had May Queens prior to this, but it was a little erratic, is what I get from the Tribune, and whether or not they had a queen or not have a queen. But the first May Queens started in the '80s and then continued on pretty faithfully. And that was a big deal to become the May Queen. At the beginning, they used to pay. They would have buy votes, and the one with the most votes got to be the May Queen. Later on, about around the 20s, somewhere there, 20s, 30s, then the high school provided the May Queen. The senior class would vote for that. Various groups would run the parade if they wanted to make money. For instance, the fire department did it a couple of years because they needed to build a firehouse, or they needed a fire truck. Somehow or other, this was a money-making operation. Now, what in the world, you know, other than the dance and people paying to come to it, I don't know, because I don't think they really paid to get into the parade too much. But somehow or other, they made money via handling the parade and the May Day celebration. So different organizations would do that. And the chamber did it for quite some time. And then eventually it became a chamber event, the parade part did. Okay. And the celebration itself, then with the chamber, they decided it would be better to have it on a Saturday, Sunday. Eventually they had a 2-day race thing anyway. They would do May 1st, May 2nd. But as people got more involved, and especially when automobiles came in, work situations changed, and so more people could get off on a Saturday, Sunday. So they changed it to the first Saturday, Sunday after the 1st of May. And that became still the May Day celebration. By my time, in the 40s, they started about noon on Friday, because I remember we would get out early on Friday and then have Saturday and Sunday May Day celebration. And by that time also they were having a horse show. That was the big thing, and a rodeo. Those were the 2 big events. They always had the agricultural shows, you know, bringing your sheep and cows and chickens and whatever else. And it was kind of hard to have farm products as they did at the state fair, because the state fair was closer to the 1st of September, and these things were already grown then. But in May, there wasn't much already grown. It was pretty hard to display your grain, even though we had some of the best grain growers around. Unless they kept some of last year's crop, they had very little to show. But one of the exhibit buildings would be the Farm Bureau, 4-H, FFAs would all have exhibits from around the county area.
Well, hold on just a minute. Let me turn this tape over. Okay, I've got the cassette tape turned over. Now, we were talking about more about the fair than the parade. Now, everybody would, unfortunately, it was in May, and they couldn't show their harvest. But
Yeah.
what did they show? I suppose
Well,
animals.
they would, some of them would save up things. If it was an exhibit of, let's say, Vacaville's Farm Bureau or whatever, they would have canned goods. But by this time, they had the basic. They would maybe show what their area produced. And they had a lot of fruit over in that area, see. The Dixon area just had to kind of basically go on the dairy, lots of dairy stuff, big dairy town for a while. And the grains, the sheep, big sheep thing. So each area, Rio Vista, they were very well noted for a while for the beet harvesters. Couple of guys over there had invented a beet harvester. And I didn't know that they were that well noted for beets, but I guess they were. So everybody had something specific, and they had a section that just, built up their areas and what all they did. As a kid, I passed through that one pretty fast till I became part of the 4-H or something. Then we had our own little 4-H booth. And the 4-Hers and FFAers exhibit much more now than they did then, and it's more diverse, which is great for our kids who live in town because they have little animals. They have birds. You can raise quail, and this kind of thing. And then, of course, the home arts of canning and sewing and all of that. Much more of that than we did as they first started to show. It was a little bit limited. And we only had 2 buildings out there. The Madden Hall, the big Madden Hall that's there now, didn't even come until the end of the 50s. And the old exhibit hall was the only other place where we had to really exhibit anything. And the original grandstand was a great old humongous thing, wondrous thing. But it came down.
Well, tell me about the schools, your grammar school, your high school. Where did you go, and what was it like?
Well, that's another thing I've tried to locate the history of, is the schools. And of course, I'm a country school kid, so I thought that, we've got to keep a history of that.
What's a country school like?
A country school is a wondrous thing where you all go to school in one room, unless you have a big bunch of people and you have a second room to put the little kids. Grant School was my school, and that was at the west end of what we call Dixon Ave West, where Dixon Ave meets Meridian. It's the only school building, only country school building left standing. It's a home now. He's converted it into a home, but I did go out and get some pictures because all of the rest have either been moved or burned or whatever. Tremont School was out east of town. It burned. And there was Sylvieville School, which was right across and in the midst of the old town of Sylvieville. It came down. I think it was just taken down. All of these school buildings, like my father and his sister and brothers all went to Grant School. But it was a little wood building then. Then about the time that cement came and they were able to make concrete and plaster, the schools in town, we had a public school which was wood, and we had the academy which became the high school. Wood. 2-story arrangements. So as these became very rickety, they took the public school down because they thought the north wind was going to blow it over, and they built right in front of it the grammar school, which had the Spanish arches, and that is sort of the motif that you will see all of the old country schools became. From 1913, 1912 to about 1918, when this school was built, then because they were all part of a district, under the county education, Board of Education, the country schools decided they wanted new schools or needed new schools because all of theirs had been built in like 1870 something, and they kind of followed this Spanish. All of them had this Spanish arch kind of a thing. Sylvieville did, Grant did, And that's why I'm glad I got a picture of it, because it kind of gives you that flavor. And I've asked everybody I know that's old enough to have gone to one, please, if you've got a photo, get it to us so we can get a copy for the archives. But it was interesting, they all followed this same, what had been in town as the public school. The country schools all rebuilt in between 1913, let's say, and 1918. And the area would have to kind of help come, the schools were not built totally by the county or whatever. I don't think they got all their funding that way. So they would have to have a school bond, or something, some such, to raise the money to build their little schools. They all had little school trustees. And everybody sat in one room. The teachers, poor things, I don't know how they handled it. We had anywhere from 20 to 25 people at Grant, and all the big kids got to sit over by the window in the big desks. Us little kids, we had to sit. Now this is talking 1939, 40. We had to sit in the little desks. We had to write with these great big old black pencils. They got the nice pretty yellow ones like people use now. Very envious of that. One day, a little girl and I, Issa Lyra, snuck in. How in the world we did this, because we were only 6, and decided we wanted a yellow pencil. We got into the teacher's desk and found the yellow pencil. Had to drag a chair up to the pencil sharpener because they were, of course, unsharpened. And the teacher walked in and caught us sharpening these. Oh, mercy. I'll never forget that. Never stole another thing in my life. I didn't actually steal. I was just kind of envious of these other guys that had these pretty pencils. 3 of us in the first grade.
3 in the first grade?
Glenn Wilson and Issa Lyra and I. And that's about how all of the things, and big families, there would be all the Files boys. They had a dairy. There were 5 of them. So you'd see this kind of a family type thing. All the Lyra kids.
Now, when you weren't in school and you weren't busy doing farm work, which
I didn't
probably not much time, but what would kids do for recreation?
That's another thing. When the kids nowadays say, there's nothing to do, I don't remember ever being bored. And I was an only kid on a farm, and I'd have to go someplace to get, any kind of action with some, interaction with another kid. We had the animals to play with, I guess, if we wanted to. I had a swing, I think. I might go down to the neighbors sometimes. I really didn't work. Those chores were just, an occasional thing that my dad, because being Daddy's little girl, he pretty much spoiled me, Your interaction was with the neighbors. My mother tried to get me, little things to play with. Like, I did not like girl things. I was not fond of dolls, and I didn't like paper dolls, and I would rather play cowboys and Indians. And it was a great thing when I got a bicycle because I could ride that. I even bought my own skates in San Jose, but we didn't have any cement that was decent enough to skate on. So we had this little patch in front of on our porch, and I had to be careful so I didn't fall off the end. And then I took my skates to school. Now this is a memorable occasion. I was about 9 by now. My brother was in the Air Force, and it was May. And I took it to school because they had a bigger space of cement on their front porch, see? And the kids were saying that I was showing off because I had my skates and I wouldn't let anyone else skate on them. And the teacher, they started being kind of mean to me, I guess, probably rightfully so. And the teacher corrected them and they said, no, you mustn't do that. You must remember that her brother just died. And this was a period of time when my mother had to fly back to Tennessee because he had been an instructor in B-17s. And in some of the training, whatever, they had a crash landing. And he was alive at the moment. They got him out. And my mother got back in time to see him, but he never really regained consciousness. Now, I'm 9, almost 9. It's all about the same time as my birthday, you know, what's supposed to be an exciting time in a kid's life. And I had gone down to my grandma's, I guess, and I had saved up this $3. And she was in a town where there was a hardware store, and I went down and bought the skates, so I was so proud of these skates. That's another thing, that in those days, a pair of skates was like a big deal. A bicycle was a big deal. Well, now if you don't have 3 or 4 pair of skates, or 3 or 4 bicycles, you haven't, you know, really lived at all. So the skate incident and my brother's dying all kind of as a strange little memory. Someone else even gave me my birthday party. A good friend of my mother's gave a birthday party. You know, they're all trying to distract me from what was going on. And I remember my mother, of course, being all worked up, and my dad having to take her to the train, I presume, because the train had to take her to an airplane someplace to fly her. And I remember riding in the car, and I gave her whatever it was I had saved up, $7 or whatever, and told her she could have that, you know, for whatever she needed. I don't know where these things come from. They had to have come either from the parents or whatever, but you cared for one another to a point where a little kid would say, here, you take this, because you probably need it more. Now, where does a kid get that, you know? So I kind of remember that, and I think, well, whatever my folks did, it must have been right, you know, and you try to pass that on to your own children. So that was a kind of a strange memory in the 40s.
What about World War II? How did that affect Dixon?
Well, again, as everybody said, in the Depression and during the war, we survived beautifully. Farmers got a better gas stamp and rubber stamp, you know, like for tires, because they were the supplier of the food. So I don't think we ever wanted for gasoline or for that kind of thing. However, we only had a truck and a car, you know. Some of the stories that my mother would tell in this diary, this car breaking down or having a flat tire, and she's all alone out there somewhere, and having to walk back to wherever the nearest phone is to get somebody to come help repair it. When you're out, that's one thing. When you're out in the country, doctors, repairmen, you learn to do an awful lot on your own, I guess. And my dad was not a mechanic. It just bothered him no end when his 2 brothers were off on their own, and he had to be in charge of the tractor. He just was a real worrywart. That was not his expertise. So in those days, whatever he learned about mechanics and the truck and the car, it was just hit and miss. We only had the one guy in town, Carpenter Brothers, who were they were the blacksmiths. I do remember going into town a lot to get parts like a plow welded or something fixed on a rake or whatever. That part of the 40s, I remember going in there, and the ice cream place, getting a cornucopia, because this was a German, Mr. Gerlach had the ice cream parlor.
Well, tell me about some of those businesses in Dixon. The ice cream parlor, I hadn't heard about that.
Well, Gerlach's was the ice cream parlor. And I don't remember a whole lot, because I maybe would get in like once a week, the most. Once a week on Sunday, and then maybe sometime, because my dad had to come in for some other reason.
Did you have to come in to get mail? Or was
Oh,
it
no,
delivery?
Mail was rural
Mail
route.
was rural
Yeah.
delivery then.
Everybody had a post with a thing on top.
Right.
And yeah, you got your mail delivered. But in town, I mostly remember the ice cream place. The theater was across the way. Occasionally I would get to see a movie. If my folks would come into a lodge meeting, which was in the Masonic Hall, which was right in the middle of the block between A and B Street. And grocery stores. I think there was a Purity Market there by this time in the 40s, right next to Masonic Hall. Originally, it had been the Van Zant's store at one time. And the Van Zants, you see, are part of my family. That would be my dad's sister. Remember I said the sister was the oldest? the only girl in the family, and she married a Van Zandt, who was another big old family that you will probably do some interviewing on. But there was a purity store, and there was Farmers Exchange. We did a lot in the Farmers Exchange. Got our gunny sacks there, and that was around the bend and going west near the depot. Good old store. Had everything from soup to nuts there, and you could order it or get it. I'm trying to think, lanterns, I don't know, anything. Sew any of the twine that you sewed your sacks with, all that kind of stuff. You could always get it at the Farmers Exchange. And of course, the Carpenter Brothers. And the Carpenter Brothers were the blacksmith and the mortician. If anybody died, they came. And the mortuary was right attached to the blacksmith shop for that period of time. Interesting. I don't remember the banks too much. First Northern Bank was really First National Bank then, and I had a savings account there. And we were always connected to that bank. The bank across the street was the Bank of America, or originally the Bank of Dixon. The only two banks in town. And I don't remember too many other things. The lodge halls, up above the Oddfellows Hall was the hall where the Grange would meet. My dad and mother were not in the Native Daughters or Oddfellows or anything. They were Mason and Eastern Star, so they went to that other hall. But because they were Grangers, part of the Dixon Grange, then I would go up into the Grange Hall with them. Everything was up above. How these old folks ever got up there, I don't know. It was just like, you just went upstairs. It had to, the secret stuff was going on. So they put everything up above.
Masons were a pretty important part of Dixon. There's
Oh.
some other, you
They
mentioned
were
the Native
pretty-
Daughters.
Yeah.
So
And the Redmen.
the Redmen, now what's that?
Well, the Redmen and the Pocahontas. Now, this was very big through Depression time, through World War I presume. I've got pictures of these guys on floats, all dressed up as Redmen. It's, God, I don't know, it's a lodge of men, just kind of like your moose, I presume. And the Pocahontas were the same thing. They all those guys met in the Oddfellows building. Still do, I guess, for all I know. And that's up above that corner building on First Nay. Down below is Bud's now, but prior to that it was the Corner Cafe in my time. But we never ate out. That was another thing, socializing. You got anything down there for socializing?
No, tell me all about socializing.
People came to town on a Sunday, and part of it was religion, part of it was socializing. Now, I don't know about the folks in town, but for country folk, this was how you got together. And you almost always got together afterwards with somebody for lunch. Okay? And if it was summertime, you'd get a bunch of them together, and you'd go up Pewter Creek, picnic lunch. Everybody brought something, spread it out, played in the water of Pewter Creek, had a big old picnic, played a little baseball, visited. Great old time. Great old time. Sometimes we'd come in and have church and then go to someone's house in town for lunch. Then maybe my mother would ask them all back out for dinner. So Saturday, Sunday, those were the times you got together and socialized. That was a lot of fun. My only occasion to get together with people of my own age.
Mm-hmm.
I had the measles when I was 6. That's still in the 40s, isn't it?
I guess so.
And the doctor came, Dr. Stalling.
Dr. Stalin?
Dr. Stolle. In fact, his son, Doc Stolle, lived over here. He passed away. His wife's still there. Dr. Stolle was a very sweet old man. But he came all the way out, that's 6 miles, to check me. Well, what are you going to say? Kid's got measles, keep dark glasses on her or pull the shades. Some reason about you could go blind if you got out in the bright light. And so my mother and my aunts would all entertain me, take care of me. Keep my dad out so that he wouldn't catch it. He did get the mumps from me when we moved into town. That was still in the 40s.
Now, I understand Dixon had several doctors, which I think is a little surprising. I think somebody told me there were 4 in the 1930s, which Seems like an awful lot for a small town.
Well, maybe there were. Dr. Evans was the very first doctor in town. This is from my research of First Dixon.
Hmm.
And he lived over by the Methodist Church, excuse me. By the 30s and the 40s, now, Zanette can probably give you some of the names better than I. Because farm kids were a pretty healthy lot. I only got the measles probably because I started school,
Hmm.
you know, and everybody got everything else. But I never got anything else to require a doctor. A dentist, I didn't even go to the dentist until I was 12. Amazing thing. Well, we had a great fear of dentists. What was the name of that dentist? Began with a W. Well, anyway, but these terrible stories would come to kids, you know, like he'd have his knee in your chest and these great big pliers to pull out a tooth or something. Who wanted to go to the dentist? So, I put that off for some time. But I guess maybe by that time they had 3 max. I don't know. I didn't pay attention.
Well, to kind of switch subjects and maybe go back to what we were talking about, I've talked to other people and they said after World War I, some German families would change the name of their family, drop an E on the end so it wouldn't sound so German. Now, such a thing didn't happen after World War II, or did it? Do you know?
But you know, I was just talking about that to somebody, wondering about the Lutheran Church. First of all, this is my dad's story. Is his recollection when the boys went off to the war. And of course, they were fighting Germany. Sievers was a big German name, as were many of these other names, you know. And Stolp. My grandfather had remarried after the first wife passed away. He married a Stolp, and she had 2 sons who also went off to war at the same time as his 2 boys. In town, the Gerlachs, and what my dad recalls is that it was verboten to speak German anymore. We didn't change our name, but we spoke English.
I didn't realize you spoke German.
No, I didn't.
Oh.
He's talking about themselves.
Okay, the other generation.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And his father would not allow them to speak anything but English and do things in English. So to gather up any old German history was something. And I'm sure that you would get this from Teig. His family evidently spoke it if they were at home alone, but if you went into town or whatever, you speak English.
Yeah, he told me that.
And of course in the schools, even as they were little, these kids, I'm sure that's all they spoke there. They maybe spoke in German when they went home. And by the time I came along, I mean, there was no better English being spoken than in our families, and beautifully, you know. My dad had beautiful penmanship, beautiful English, grammatically perfect. And so we didn't hardly hear words, German words. And in World War II, I guess because of the influence of World War I, there wasn't so much of that. You were American by this time. You paid your dues, you know. So there wasn't quite so much, except for this little Gerlach ice cream parlor. And I can remember people going in there, and these people, little roomers, like in that back room where this curtain hung. They might be having secret meetings. I'm like 8. Really? Wow. And I don't kind of believe they were, but they did have a very strong German accent. And Scheel, Scheel, were related to the Gerlachs. And Martha Scheel was in school just a year behind me when we were in grammar school. And I can remember her speaking German. And of course, this was during World War II. She spoke very good English, too. She was a very bright girl. But everyone was a little bit leery of her. She was a little bit different. It's a little strange. Still in the 40s. What are we talking about? World War II? near the end, we moved. Now, I think a lot of this had to do with my brother dying, and my mother just, it was very hard for her to deal with, because that was basically her only child till I came. There was a chance to buy this big house just on the outskirts of town on the west called the Peters Place, big two-story place. Well, my mother got her eye on that, and my father was able to buy it. So in '44, we moved from the old Schmidt place into town. So I was in country school up through 4th grade, and then 5th grade I started the grammar school here in town. So I had got to have a little bit of each, which was kind of a blessing in a way. By the time of 5th grade, they were starting to have band. Now, they didn't have music in the grammar schools up until that point, which was really great. You had to drum up an instrument somewhere. But I got to be in the band then, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th grade, excellent. And things that I would probably not have gotten in the country school, I came in. I was a little bit of a greenhorn for 5th grade. Very unusual for me to have all these kids all one grade, all of a sudden.
Well, what about the difference between the city kids and the country kids? Did people pay attention to that, or did it not?
Oh, well, we didn't really dress all that different. You got to remember that by this time there were lodges and there were organizations going on, so the country people came in to where the city was, for these meetings, and they all, fashion-wise, they knew pretty much what they were doing. Kids we all looked pretty much alike. Sometimes the farm kids, especially the boys, would have to go home early to help with chores or stuff, especially the dairy boys. And dairy girls too. Well, they worked hard.
And they got out of school early to go?
No, they just had to hustle on home,
Oh.
And so if there were any school activities going on, especially in the high school, as I recall, it was a trial for some of these boys to be in the sports, And when our class only had 30 in it, all the way through, let's say, basically it was like 28 to 30 people. By the time we graduated from high school, there were only 30 people. So you try to put together a football team with classes that range anywhere from 20 to 30 people. You want these big old husky farm kids on your team. So they did everything they could. Usually you got a driver's license by the time you were 15. Or at least a permit, especially if you were on the farm, so that you could drive. All of us learned to drive out in the field somewhere by the time we were 10, something like that.
What were the roads like out there in the country?
Oh, just a plain old road that barely could get two people past one another. And they kind of, as they kept repairing them, they had a dome on them. And I remember my dad driving this old Chevy of ours. And everybody would try to drive right down the middle of the road because that would wear the tires out more evenly, he said. Otherwise, if you did it this way, you see that wasn't even. I didn't quite understand the logic on that, but that was what he did. We had a Chevrolet truck, no doors on it. I don't know, I guess he took them off because it was a necessity until he taught me how to stand up and drive it. He had to be able to hop out, pitch the hay on the back, and then get back and stop it. He taught me how to just steer, and I had no length of leg to put the brake on, so he said, when we get to the end of the field, turn the key off. So he put it in first, get started on one side of the field, and away we go. And we get to the other end, he's pitching hay like crazy. Get to the end, I turn off the key, and it goes ka-chunk, ka-chunk, like.
Hey, let me put a new tape in this machine here. Okay, we've got a new tape going.
We're talking about roads.
Roads and how you learned how to drive.
The country roads had no names as they do now. That came along, I think, not until, like, I want to say the 60s. Like we have a Schroeder Road. And they fortunately tried to name them after some of the old timers. We have a Sievers Road, which I'm very proud of. Goes right to our place. And Schroeder Road. and Thistle Road, But then, in those days, you just knew where you were going. You either turned at an oak tree or somebody's house. That's how you gave directions. Some of the old parade routes in town, they didn't say turn on West B or what. Well, sometimes they did, but very often they would forget, and they'd say turn at the Peters house and go north, and then you turn at the school and go west, So you got these visual IDs of a place, and especially out in the country, because they just weren't. The Rio Dixon Road, the Rio Vista Dixon Road was the only one that had sort of a name of any type because it connected two towns. And then Highway 40 finally came through. It had a name. And the Lincoln Highway. Actually, the Lincoln Highway was even before that one. It came around on Porter Road and came into town. That's the one the Boy Scouts put little standards on every, 10 miles or something? You remember that? No.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's way before.
The standards. What was that?
Well, they were
I
little
was
markers.
A Boy Scout.
Huh?
I was a Boy Scout.
Yeah, but you were probably too young. They put these markers out, and they were like cement posts. Mm-hmm. And I forget whether they were like every 10 miles or every 5 miles, and it was to mark the Lincoln Highway. I haven't gotten into that. Barbara Schultze can tell you that one.
Well, speaking of, we were talking a while back, we spent some time talking about Germans, and the other big ethnic group, I guess that's the name, here in Dixon, are the Portuguese. What about that? What do you know about Portuguese? They had their own parade, didn't they?
Yep, they had the Holy Ghost Festival. Now, again, I wasn't here when they began, but what I remember is, again, the early 40s, maybe the late 30s. I remember some of the families, the Dutras, the Bellows, the Mellows, and I just know that Mimi Azevedo was the first queen because I looked that one up, and she's still around too.
I just spoke with her last
and
week.
some of the
Wonderful lady.
Brazil family, they're still around, and I keep picking at them. Give us some pictures, give us some stories, and what I've picked up out of the old Tribunes. The things I recall is that we would have a May Day parade, and that would be in May. Along came the end of June or the 1st of July, and it would be the Holy Ghost Parade. Hot? Boy. And the Holy Ghost Parade, all of our churches, except the Methodist Church, were kind of in a group. Our church, the original Baptist church, was on First Street, became the community church. And a lot of people would gather on the steps going up, because the parade would start at the Catholic Church, which was the next street east. That was 2nd Street. And they'd parade around, come on A Street, and then take off toward the fairgrounds on 1st Street, South 1st. And they'd go past the church, and it was almost always right about the time we were in session. We'd have church from 11 to noon. They would have their service, something like around 10 or whatever else they did, and then start their parade, and the drums and the, whatever, coming by. All the Protestants shaking their heads. But the Portuguese festival was a happy, happy time, as far as I can recall. Generous people. And they would put on these big old barbecues out there. In fact, they were probably the ones that did the deep pit. There's a big deep pit that was built out there. And they would barbecue, started the day before, and sink this meat down there in these coals and cook this stuff. And it was called sopa. They'd bring this out after the parade was over, and the men would be carving this stuff up, and they had big wads of French bread. Don't know whether they ever served beans or corn or anything else. Basically, it was that, hot coffee, maybe punch for the kids, and nobody paid. It was like a gift to the community type of thing. You just came and helped yourself. And the one thing I remember about the Dutras during World War II is as it came to an end, and the veterans were coming back, or the wounded were coming back to Travis, which was called Fairfield-Sassoon Air Base then, had a hospital. Mr. Dutra invited all these people that were able to come out to his ranch, which was out here on Pedrick. And he put on one of these typical Portuguese barbecues for these guys. There's a big write-up in the paper, which I wrote most of it down, and the women made pies and cakes, and he had one of these sofa barbecues with the big beef roast, and it's just lots of soupy stuff, and over the French bread. And I just thought, wasn't that a really neat thing for this man to do, you know, in appreciation for these veterans? I searched and searched for this recipe, because all I had was the memory of it. Finally, I got it from B. Fairfield, who was a Brazil, who was a Portuguese family, and she gave it to me, and I invited some friends over, and we made this big old sopa thing, huge in a Weber, but it was good. It was good. Brought back those old memories.
You know, I always hear about the Germans and the Portuguese.
You don't hear about the Irish?
Is there anybody else? No,
Oh,
tell me
good
about
grief.
the Irish.
Oh, mercy. The Irish. Yes, there were Irish and English around here that, I mean, I don't know why just the two, because maybe you've only been interviewing the German people.
And Portuguese.
And
that's
Portuguese.
all I've been talking.
Oh, okay, well, you got to get some of the Kilkennys. Get some of those Kilkennys.
Well, I guess Collier. That's
Collier? No.
Collier. He's not German or Portuguese. He's Welsh English.
Okay. Yeah, because we had a few English. But I remember the Irish, happy people. This Marilyn Costamagna, her dad was very Irish, and he worked for the railroad. A lot of them came in here, via that. And some, like the Kilkennys, were big farmers, which is kind of unusual. But I guess during the potato famine over there, they had to come somewhere, but they ended up growing other things. Oh, I thought the Irish were very happy-go-lucky. My experience with the Irish versus the German is my dad and Jim Kilkenny. They were opposite on everything. One was a Protestant, one was a Catholic. One belonged to the Knights of whatever, the Columbus,
Knights of Columbus. Mm-hmm.
And one was a Mason. One was a Democrat and one was a Republican. They were always at odds, and yet they were good friends, but loved to dig one another. Fire department. Jim was the fire chief. My dad was one of the first fire district. I want to say superintendent. That's not the right word. They had a board for the rural fire, and they formed this little district, and they had fire commissioner. So he and Jim's dad, John Kilkenny, and Mr. Brown were the first fire commissioners. And so he was on this whole board thing while Jim was the fire chief. And so, they had a lot of interaction, but never agreed. Never agreed. The Irish I always thought were kind of good, especially Pat. What was Madeline? I'm not supposed to ask you. Hopkins, Pat Hopkins. He still had the brogue. Back to the 40s in the Irish. Pat would stand at the gate to the ball field. By this time we had a ball field, and softball became an evening sport, relaxation, kind of a recreation thing. He was the collector of the funds, 10 cents to get in. And he had the lumberyard apron, and he would collect this. And Josh was everybody. He just lived about across the street from wherever it was, so I guess that's why he did the collecting. I just thought he was, and Mama Hopkins was the jolliest soul, kind of a round lady, very happy-go-lucky. And I presume that the Kilkennys were the same. I have this great picture of the Kilkennys. Jim's mother, in this big old car. You remember Cheaper by the Dozen? That's what this car looked like. They were getting ready for the parade. They were going to be, cars were a big thing at the end of 1910 to the 20s. They always were in the parade, decorate their car. Here's the Kilkenny family, just boiling out, all dressed up, in their finery to be in the parade. Oh, great picture, great picture. What else? What were we talking about? Oh, the Irish. Those are about the only Irish ones I really remember. There's so many of them. There were Kilkennys all over the place. So they branched out and made some more little Irishmen somewhere.
Mm-hmm. That's what happens with Irishmen. Well, Let's see. I guess we've talked about a lot of subjects. What should we talk about now? What have I forgot to ask you?
Well,
What was important in the 40s, late 30s in Dixon that we forgot to talk about?
well, of course, to me, coming into town was a big thing. Just learning, having blocks to walk as opposed to miles was a change. And having more friends, you see, you had to learn to share now. And being an only kid and on your own, that took me a while, learning how to share. Doing stuff with other kids. But I learned. I was a pretty fast learner. Having that big old house was great. And of course I know my mother, who loved to give parties and loved to entertain, was having a blast. And one of the first parties we had when I came in, I was either 6th grade, 7th grade, was a Halloween party for the kids in our class. Spooky old basement down there, and I mean it had legitimate cobwebs and rats running along on the heat vent thing. Oh yeah, and dunking for the apples. We did whatever was ordinary for a Halloween party. I remember doing that. Going to the fair with a boyfriend first time, and riding on the Ferris wheel. They didn't have great big old tilt-a-whirl was our wildest ride. Merry-go-round, tilt-a-whirl, Ferris wheel. So they hadn't really expanded into, because I mean we didn't need that kind of entertainment yet. We hadn't gotten into television. Radio, if you had a radio, that was exciting. Listening to the radio, see, that was another one of our social things to do.
That was a social thing. I thought that.
Yeah,
was
sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, you would have folks come over for dinner or whatever, and then you'd all sit down and listen to the Jack Benny. Yeah, because he was usually on Sunday.
Yeah.
What did we do besides go to the movies? Swimming pool. Swimming pool came into Dixon about 1936, and this was part of that NRA of Franklin Roosevelt that the town paid for half, the government paid for half, and it created work for these guys. Well, that swimming pool is still there. They've expanded on some of it, and some of the grounds are different. But I remember that swimming pool. I loved to swim. I mean, I was an old Pewter Creek kid, and to have that swimming pool in town, that's where everybody went. If you were able to swim, that was the summer entertainment. Okay. Winter entertainment, you just got together with your friends. And entertained, played cards, played Monopoly, did that kind of stuff. But I don't remember ever complaining about not having anything to do. Sometimes we'd be in skits and work up that kind of stuff, Kids, the boys in the playing games, jump rope was the big thing for the girls. I was bad at that. I was not good. Softball I could do. The boys played those kinds of sports. The girls did the other kinds, like the jump rope thing. Jacks. Mumbledy peg. I always wanted to do the boy things. They wouldn't let me.
Mumbledy peg was played.
Well, you draw the circle or the pie thing or something and take the knife and flip it down so it sticks. You had to have a money spot packed. And then you got that slice of the pie. I love that one. But I didn't get to play that very much, and I didn't have my own knife. My first sport thing I got, my dad took me to Sacramento and bought me a left-hander's glove. That was something. Those were rare, too.
Left-hander glove?
Uh-huh. I still have it. My kids say it looked like Mickey Mouse. It really did. But it was precious to me. Yeah, I enjoyed the boys' things. I learned to whistle because boys whistled. And it was a very good attention getter if you needed to call somebody,
Oh,
You
yeah.
whistled very loudly. Or all the other little bird call whistles. Didn't do well with the girl things. I didn't like to dress up. Mother would make me dress up, and I was in a parade as a little May Queen with these girls that were about 10 years older than I. Some of them are still around, and I've given them copies of this photo. And I am the most unhappy looking frilly thing in a wagon with these 6 girls as my attendants. Poor mother. Gets a daughter that would rather be driving a tractor than dress up. But I still did all of the girl things for her benefit.
Well, I guess we've covered everything, but we're gonna meet again and do another video like this. We're gonna talk
Great.
to some more people. But until then, thanks for taking the time. On behalf of the Dixon Public Library, I want to thank you for doing this.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Okay, I guess I'll turn this off then.